commemorating the past, reflecting on the present, envisioning a future. 1962.
Mother of men and ruler of the world, raises her noble head and approaches the court of justice with the clarion call for equal rights for Bahamian women.
Our right to vote and our right to hold office should never be taken lightly and should be exercised at every opportunity.
True, we women are ready, willing, and able. You must no longer deny us our rights.
A theoretical sort of presentation, and then I move into an analysis of a type of case that possibly could be brought before the courts. My presentation is about a way of thinking about the relationship between law and gender inequality in Bahamian society, a way of thinking that I hope has implications for a critical legal praxis in relation to gender inequality. The relationship I wish to focus on, with specific reference to the spousal rape exception under Bahamian rape laws, is governed by two interrelated factors. One, law's seemingly neutral stance vis-a-vis gender inequality, and two, the variable capacity of the Constitution to regulate laws that are discriminatory in their effect, as opposed to laws that are discriminatory in and of themselves. A law does not in and of itself have to discriminate on the basis of gender to have a discriminatory effect. How is this possible? First, consider that a law that discriminates in itself is a law that, in the use of sexist language and notions, explicitly and directly reveals itself as discriminatory. The great achievement of 1961 in creating equality in the sphere of voting rights paved the way for most laws in the Bahamas to be written or constructed free of overt gender bias. Milestones along this process were the changes made to sexual and domestic violence offenses that require the adoption of gender-neutral expressions and the achievement of gender equality in laws of intestacy. How then does a Bahamian law, a regime of law that generally does not in and of itself discriminate on the basis of gender any longer, for the most part, function in relation to continuing forms of gender inequality in society? It is more than an irony that in our rush to remove the overt expressions of gender bias in the laws of the Bahamas, we have further concealed the main way in which law functions in relation to gender power relations. While one of the liberal progressive agendas in our community as it relates to law has been to erase the surface trace of gender discrimination, that is, the elimination of the targeted use of law as an instrument of male domination, the effect has been to reinforce a key tenet of liberal legal ideology, the idea of law as an ahistorical, autonomous institution operating above the fray of power relations and the institutional structures to which they give rise. The first plank in any conceptual framework needed to examine the role of law in the power relations relating to gender in the Bahamas requires the affirmation of the critical legal perspective that the neutrality of law means that law can never be neutral in relation to forms of domination in society. With the adoption of the critical perspective towards gender relations, this means that while one may concede the progress has been made in the law to eliminate all forms of gender-based discrimination in law, an acute awareness concerning the way in which law indirectly, through its apparent anti-sexist stance, legitimates the state of affairs between the sexes in society is maintained. This involves a shift in focus from one that is centered on the gender dimension in the substance of law to one that is trained on the underlying structure of gender inequality existing in the shadow of law. An important part of the conceptual framework being advanced here, then, holds fast to the position that any critical legal analysis of the relationship between law and male-female power relations in society be allowed to be driven by a thorough understanding of the social institutions and spaces in which these relations are embedded. This is not as easy as it might seem. When laws themselves are subjected to the constitutional requirement of equality and scrubbed clean of their overt expressions of gender bias, the way gender dynamics shape social life is seen no longer as a function of state power, but the way that private life plays out in the social sphere as a consequence of the apparent natural order of things. With all doubt concerning the state's impartiality towards gendered social life removed, gendered social life retreats from the stage of visibility concealed by the quotidian naturalness through which it is regarded. Of course, this putative natural order of power is an ideological social construction driven by power relations, its ontological position irreducible to the natural order. Still, the law's function in legitimizing and thus concealing institutional structures of gender-based inequality and oppression cannot be reduced to simply a matter of laws being purged of discriminatory language and concepts under the organizing principle of the rule of law. The seemingly removed and above the fray position of law is the effect of a complex set of interlocking legal doctrines and practices. For instance, consider the role of the principle of separation of power, the doctrine of locus standi, and judicial reasoning in maintaining law's image of neutrality. I then go in my paper through an analysis of the separation of power doctrine, locus standi, judicial reasoning as mechanisms that project law's image of neutrality. But for time, I'm going to skip over that part of my paper. I now turn to the second way in which law's governance of gender relations can be conceptualized. Specifically, I lay out a conceptual framework for examining whether laws or actions of the state that are gender biased in their effect, as opposed to being discriminatory in and of themselves, can be regulated by the courts through the Constitution. Before addressing the capacity of the Constitution to protect against the latent function of law in maintaining discrimination on the basis of gender, it is important to establish the scope of the constitutional protection against laws and actions of the state that are gender discriminatory in themselves. The analysis begins with Article 26, found in the chapter of the Constitution that is designed to protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual. Article 26 lays out in detail the specific protection against discrimination afforded the individual. It protects individuals from laws or actions of the state which discriminate on the grounds of race, place of origin, political opinions, color, or creed. Alas, much to the embarrassment of progressives living in the country, Article 26 does not prohibit discrimination on the grounds of either sex or gender. In this day and age, this omission might seem to be an error in drafting rather than a deliberate exclusion, as it was found to be by the Privy Council in the case of Pungavanan. Still, the more salient question is whether the prohibited grounds of discrimination found in Article 26 form either a closed list of grounds or a list to which other grounds of discrimination can be added. The prevailing view is that the grounds of discrimination the individual is protected against under Article 26 is closed, and that if sex or gender is not mentioned in the article as a prohibited ground of discrimination, then an individual cannot seek protection against this form of discrimination under Article 6. The omission of sex or gender as a ground of discrimination in Article 26 seems even more bizarre when it is considered that the opening article, Article 15 of the Bill of Rights, which was once thought to be non-justiciable and a preamble to the enumerated rights contained in Chapter 3 of the Constitution, refers to the entitlement of individuals in the Bahamas, whatever their sex, to the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual found in Article 15 and the subsequent enumerated provisions of Chapter 3. Given the growing tide of judicial opinion in favor of the view that the opening article of the Bill of Rights is enforceable with respect to those rights contained in Article 15 that are not found in the enumerated provisions of the Bill of Rights, the inherent tension that exists between Article 15 and Article 26 is clear, as the Bahamas Constitutional Review Commission in its 2006 preliminary report and provisional recommendations suggest concerning discrimination on the grounds of sex. Quote, the conflict arises from the inclusion of sex as a prohibited ground of discrimination in Article 15 and its omission from the particular article designed to protect against discrimination, Article 26. To what extent then does Article 15 of the Constitution provide a possible platform to address the constitutionality of laws or state actions that are in their effects discriminatory on the basis of sex? In the case of Matadin, involving an opening section almost identical to Article 15, Lord Hoffman suggests that the opening section, inter alia, prohibits discrimination on the prohibited grounds in the deployment of the fundamental rights within Article 15 and in the enumerated provisions of the Bill of Rights. Arguably, this could mean that Article 26 would have to be read as protecting the individual from sexual discrimination, even though sex as a ground of discrimination is not explicitly included in Article 26. Lord Hoffman disavows his implication of the reference to sexual discrimination in the opening section for the subsequent enumerated anti-discrimination clause. In Matadine, he argues against construing provisions to give effect to, quote, rights which they do not contain. Thus, he sides with a string of authorities supporting the view that the grounds of discrimination contained in provisions like Article 26 cannot be supplemented with other categories of discrimination. There are judicial decisions, however, that oppose this approach and see the list of grounds of discrimination in anti-discrimination provisions like Article 26 as non-exhaustive. If the view intensifies that, quote, there can be no room in our Constitution for any omission that permits persons of the female gender to be treated differently from those of the male gender, the latter authorities on the issue will likely prevail. If the position then is taken contrary to Lord Hoffman's position in Matadine, that because of the justiciability of the opening section, Article 26 of the Bahamian Constitution prohibits discrimination on the grounds of sex, what obstacles exist then to viewing Article 26 as protecting individuals from laws or state actions that in their effect discriminate on the grounds of sex? I shall consider this question with reference to an outline of an argument in support of a hypothetical case some group of brave women might bring to challenge the constitutionality of the rape law in this country that excludes non-consensual sex between spouses from its ambit. The specific argument would be that the law regarding the legal impossibility of spousal rape discriminates on the grounds of sex, namely against women. Because the spousal exclusion in our rape law is gender neutral, the only way to attack the provision would be to show that the law, though free of any explicit discriminatory purpose reflected in the language of the provision, is nonetheless discriminatory against women in its effect, that is, in the way it disadvantages women in actual social life, in ways that it does not disadvantage men. Based on the definition of discrimination in Article 26, an essential element in proving discrimination involves showing how an impugned law or state action would create an advantage for a comparator group not enjoyed by another comparator group, or by showing how an impugned law or state action would create for one comparator group a disadvantage not shared by another comparator group. In relation to the hypothetical case, this would mean showing how women, in fact, suffer greater disadvantage than men because of the impugned rape law. The disadvantage being the greater degree of vulnerability caused to married women by the spousal rape exclusion than caused to married men. To be clear, a married man, because of the exclusion, is prejudiced by the complete lack of protection under the rape laws that he is afforded in the event of being raped by his spouse. Married women, on the other hand, are prejudiced that much more by the spousal rape exclusion, given the reality of violence against married women in the Bahamas by their spouses. Because a married woman is more likely to be raped by her spouse than the other way around, the argument would contend that the rape laws of the Bahamas impact married women differently than they do married men. Related to this argument as part of another plank in the differential social impact analysis would be to show how the spousal rape exclusion has a differential impact on the psychology of men and women. In other words, how it works to the psychological disadvantage of women when compared to its psychological effect on men. It is beyond the scope of this presentation to go into the depth of the argument and the social psychological evidence that would have to be assembled before the Supreme Court to make such a case. In summary, though, the approach to this part of the analysis would involve explaining the psychological function of the spousal rape exclusion in a context where women understand that other women on a daily basis are the victims of rape and all forms of domestic violence, many of whom also subordinate themselves and their bodies to men as a means of economic advancement or survival. It would be a reasonable argument to assert in this context, that the spousal rape exclusion functions as a normalization device within this context precisely because the spousal rape exception does not take into account the higher risk of vulnerability that it creates for women than it does for men. In other words, the spousal rape exception operates to the psychological disadvantage of women because in the context of a society where violence against women is part of the structure of gender inequality and the everyday, it operates to affirm the normalcy of this pathological condition. To be sure, men and women internalize the normalization of violence against women, but this internalization works to the greater disadvantage of women. Arguably, it creates a mindset through which women see themselves and other women in society to be the inevitable and normal victims of male violence. This line of reasoning is similar in form to a line of reasoning that could be deployed in court to show how the spousal rape exception, because of the increased vulnerability that it creates for women than it does for men, in the context of a society where so many aspects of social life make women feel inferior to men, functions to reinforce this sense of inferiority. This form of social legal analysis, though uncommon in Bahamian courts and to many courts throughout the Commonwealth, is familiar to U.S. courts. Constitutionally sanctioned Jim Crow laws in the U.S. were overthrown through its use. In Brown and Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court's formalistic reasoning in Plessy and Ferguson, that the principle of separate but equal did not violate the protection against discrimination in the U.S. Constitution, was rejected. It was held in Brown that Jim Crow laws constructed on the principle of separate but equal, so that impugn laws did not appear on the surface to give an advantage to one group over another, had to be understood in terms of how they operated in social contexts. That is, how they impacted whites and blacks differently, given the history of slavery and race relations in the U.S. And given that history, the court held in Brown that Jim Crow laws in their effect only served to reinforce white supremacist ideology and maintain the psychology of inferiority within the African American community. The reasoning of the U.S. Supreme Court is now a classic example of how a law that appears neutral and non-discriminatory on its surface can be shown to be discriminatory when its effect on the lives of people situated differently within the social structure are considered. Assuming a good case could be made to convince the court that the spousal rape exception discriminates against women along the lines suggested, other legal obstacles to bringing the action would have to be confronted. The first concerns the specific limitation in Article 26(4)(c) that restricts the anti-discrimination provision from being applied to laws that make provision, quote, with respect to adoption, marriage, divorce, burial, devolution of property on death, or other matters of personal law, end of quote. No doubt an argument would be raised that the spousal rape exception is a law that makes provision with respect to marriage, and thus it cannot be declared discriminatory. The counter-argument to this would be that the spousal rape exception, though it creates an exception in the criminal law of rape tied to marital status, is not a law that makes provision for marriage. Rather, it is a law that remains a distinctive feature of Bahamian criminal law. The second obstacle relates to the police power limitation contained in the anti-discrimination protection. Like most other fundamental rights and freedoms in the Bill of Rights, the protection against discrimination provision in the Constitution does not protect against a law that encroaches upon a right if the law in question can be regarded as the proper exercise of a police power. That is, if the law being challenged on the grounds that it is prima facie a violation of a right can be shown to be reasonably required in the interest of some constitutionally enumerated public interest. Many constitutional protections also contain the requirement that such constitutionally recognized limitations must also be consistent with what takes place in a democratic society. In Article 26(4)(d), the police power limitation operates to exempt laws from the prohibition against discrimination if such laws are reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. Would the spousal rape exclusion, notwithstanding the possibility of it being regarded as a law that in its effect discriminates against women, be considered justifiable in a democratic society? The question would create a pivotal point in the analysis before the courts, forcing the courts to balance public interest arguments in support of the spousal rape exclusion against arguments directed at showing how inconsistent the spousal rape exception is in a democratic society, given the oppressiveness of the exception for women. To rehearse and examine the range of backward arguments that might be deployed to justify the oppression of women through the spousal rape exception is beyond the scope of this presentation, though surely to reveal their purpose as rationalizations of oppression would lie at the heart of the matter and would secure a small victory in the struggle against oppression in itself. Finally, there is the obstacle posed by the question of locus standi. Who would have locus standi to challenge the constitutionality of the spousal rape exception? Under the redress provision in our Constitution's Bill of Rights, Article 28, only persons who can allege that a violation of a fundamental right in the chapter has occurred in relation to themselves will be granted standing to argue the merits of the allegation before the Supreme Court. In other words, the plaintiff seeking redress in an action relying on fundamental rights and freedoms must show it is his or her right that is at stake, that he or she has a direct and personal interest in bringing the action. In addition, the plaintiff will only be thought of as the proper person to initiate the action if the courts are of the view that the plaintiff has been prejudiced or suffered some form of loss resulting from the alleged violation of his or her rights that is peculiar to the circumstances of the plaintiff. The implications of this restrictive test of locus standi in the redress provision of the Bill of Rights is that a plaintiff seeking to show how the rights of women generally are violated by the spousal rape exclusion through a form of representative public interest action is unlikely to acquire standing in order to have the courts make a determination regarding the arguments they wish to make. Moreover, even if the plaintiff can demonstrate that she shares in common with other women the increased vulnerability and psychological costs associated with the spousal rape exclusion, the court will want to determine whether the plaintiff has suffered an effect of the impugned law that is peculiar and that distinguishes the effect on the plaintiff from the effect of the impugned spousal rape exception on all women. This will be difficult to prove unless the plaintiff can claim to be a victim of non-consensual sex within a marriage. The only other way around the problem of locus standi for those challenging the constitutionality of the spousal rape exception will be to convince the Attorney General to take over the case as part of a relator action. In a relator action, a member of the public, as a matter of wanting to protect the public interest, sues to enforce a public right and will request the AG to join the action to overcome the objection that the member of the public bringing the action alone would not have locus standi to represent the public interest. The AG can decline or consent to this request. My conclusion. Whew. 1 minute. Advocates for the rights of women and gender equality would be advised to gain an understanding of all the factors that affect power relationships between men and women in society. And law is a factor of power within that relationship. It can function as a mechanism of repression, retarding the progressive agenda of full equality, or it can be made to serve human rights, freedoms, and progressive agendas. One way of understanding its repressive function with reference to gender relations is by understanding the way law's image of neutrality, its surface sanitized of sexist oppressions, in a context where there exists deep and seemingly intractable conditions of inequality, gives license to these conditions. One way of understanding its progressive function is by understanding that the law can be deployed, despite the many resistances placed in its way, to expose the very conditions of domination and subordination in society that it tends to legitimate, indirectly, through the impression that it gives of its distance and aloofness. Of course, the more active and meaningful understanding comes from the critical legal practice of forcing law to confront the structural power relations it functions to help constitute. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. First off, I'd like to thank Dr. Curry and the rest of the Women's Suffrage Movement's Planning Committee for inviting me to take part in this panel discussion. I would specifically like to thank Dr. Carolyn Roll from the School of Social Sciences, whose input, I'm told, was instrumental in the decision. And to my Muslim sisters and brothers, Jazakumullah khair, for coming out, and thank you to everyone else for doing the same. Okay, to the topic at hand. As Dr. Curry mentioned, I'm presenting a topic that's gender-related. The title I was provided with for this presentation was called Envisioning the Future, A Youth's Perspective on Gender. Two things. The title was extremely broad, so I used the latitude that it afforded me to present something that I am familiar with in the Bahamian context. And two, I don't think that the title youth quite applies to me. As a result, I reworked the title several times, and so what this paper is focusing on is dispelling misconceptions about Muslim women in the Bahamas. Before I get into the discussion, I want you guys to know what I'm focusing on tonight, which will be number one. I'm going to briefly mention, in keeping with the theme of this entire symposia, some of the core values I believe were inherent in and were indeed a crucial part of the women's suffrage movement. Number two, I'm going to provide an example of how far the general Bahamian public seems to have strayed from those values, with particular emphasis on the situation with respect to Muslim Bahamian women. And in that same vein, I'd like to clarify one of the key misconceptions there. And finally, I'll conclude, inshallah, by mentioning a couple of things we can do to reclaim those values going forward. When the suffrage movement began in the 1950s, it was propelled forth and sustained by a strong commitment to those Bahamian women to ideals of justice, fairness, and mutual respect. At that time, those women had to convince their male counterparts that the country could move forward only if these values were observed. They were apparently successful. They did attain the franchise. Some would contend, though, that getting the vote was a step taken to overcome racism and ensure the majority black Bahamians had a say in the development of this nation, and that it was not about the advancement of women. To this end, Wallace Carey, daughter of Eugenia Lockhart, former secretary of the PLP Women's Branch, she expressed this very sentiment when she stated in a Tribune article published on June 11th, 2010, that the women's vote was important to get numbers, to get equality for black people. It was about the vote numbers. So the struggle for women did not continue. It was gone, and it is still gone. Perhaps this held true for certain individuals at that time, and some people probably still hold that perception today. But the vote did embody, in obtaining equality, racial equality, the elements necessary to move the country forward. Again, the commitment to ideals of justice, fairness, and mutual respect. Today, we find ourselves contending with a widespread phenomenon that directly counteracts the carrying out of those ideals. This phenomenon is not a novel one. Simply put, it's ignorance, specifically lack of knowledge about one's history, which may or may not be rooted in the Bahamas, not to mention the lack of knowledge about the histories of other nations and cultures. This particular strain of ignorance, that is, not knowing one's history, not only flies in the face of all the efforts expended by both men and women whose struggles paved the way to eventual independence, but it also removes us far from the principles that spurred those individuals into action at that particular time in history, and thereby gives some of us the freedom to be unfair, unjust, and disrespectful with impunity. One way this ignorance manifests itself is by way of stereotypes, often negative, about others who reside in the Bahamas. Those others also apply to Bahamians. And because history and actions of certain nations today have shown that certain stereotypes can, and indeed do, lead to more insidious forms of discrimination toward entire groups of people within a nation, simply because those people or those groups hold principles that are viewed as contradictory to the principles of the country, no matter what the Constitution says about religious freedom. So what I chose to focus on tonight is a form of ignorance that I and many of my Muslim Bahamian sisters encounter in the Bahamas. And what I'm referring to are religious-based gender stereotypes. Now, when the suffrage movement began, it was comprised of Christian Bahamian women. 50 years on, the Bahamas has evolved considerably. While the suffrage movement and the newly enfranchised were basking in the glory of finally being able to exercise their right to vote, attained after grueling efforts, another development was taking place in the Bahamas. An individual named Bashan Salahuddin was teaching Bahamians about Islam. A small group of individuals at the time believed in the validity of this creed as such. And because of that, during the 1970s, it led to the formation of Jama'atul Islam, the revolutionary Islamic movement in the Bahamas during the year of 1978. And at the time, Brother Mustafa Khalil Kalfani was chosen as the leader. But actually, Islam in the region goes even further back than that. Abdullah Hakim Quick actually says it goes as far back as the days of slavery, whereas we know most of the slaves came from the coast of West Africa, and at that time, Islam was well established in those countries. And he states that when they were brought to the Caribbean, they were forced to forget their native languages. Arabic was, for the most part, outlawed amongst the slave masses. It was forbidden to openly pray, fast, or practice Islam. Pork was forced on the slaves as a main staple meat. Families were broken up, and family life was not encouraged. Adulterous relationships with their painful and destructive consequences became the norm. The vibrant West African Islamic heritage was brutally suppressed by the slave masters and their metropolitan powers. Now, bringing it back to today, the Muslim community in the Bahamas is under 1% of the entire population. But most people, I would say, aren't familiar with who we are. You may have some knowledge about the group, but you're probably not that familiar with who we are. So who are we? As Muslims, we are women who submit to the will of Allah, not man. We adhere to the best of our ability to the message of the final messenger and prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We believe in the completeness and perfection of our religion, as stated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, Surah Ma'idah, where he says, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا, which translates to, this day I have perfected for you your religion and completed my favor upon you and have approved for you Islam as religion. We believe that Islam is a religion of justice, righteousness, and purity, and all that that brings with it. As Bahamians, we are, and will inshallah continue to be, actively involved in numerous spheres within the larger Bahamian community. We are members of the public service. We're business owners. We're well seen throughout the private sector. We're committed participants in civil society organizations because we don't believe that there's anything incongruous or contradictory about wearing the headscarf and being a professional. Contrary to what some people may think, the hijab does not hinder our ability to think or function as full human beings. Notwithstanding these realities, though, misperceptions about us remain. There are far too many for me to list and go into this evening, so I'm going to focus on one, and that is the headscarf. Most of the slurs that we do hear, or the questions that we do get for those who actually question us instead of judging and throwing out slurs, are related to the hijab. So that misperception, our dress code, this ting that we wear on our head, is not a form of oppression. It's a confirmation of our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and all that He's decreed. As He stated in the Quran, with respect to the covering, with respect to our dress code, وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنَّ وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُنَّ وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَلْيَضْرَبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جِيُوبِهِنَّ وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا لِبُعُولَتِهِنَّ. And say to the faithful women to lower their gazes and to guard their private parts and not to display their beauty except what is apparent of it, and to extend their head coverings to cover their bosoms and to not display their beauty except to their husbands, fathers, so on. He also, in referring to the dress code, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also states in Surah Ahzab, verse 59, يا أيها النبي قل لأزواجك وبناتك ونساء المؤمنين يدنين عليهن من جلابيبهن ذلك أدنى أن يعرفن فلا يؤذين وكان الله غفورا رحيما. O Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, tell your wives and your daughters and the women of the believers to bring down over themselves part of their outer garments. That is more suitable that they will be known and not be abused, and Allah is all forgiving and merciful. So in adhering to these commands, we as Muslim women cover as we do. To us, the hijab represents modesty, faith, and a commitment to certain principles. Issues relating to the headscarf and oppression have emanated chiefly from Western societies. It's merely an expression of faith, an acceptance of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about how the world should work. We acknowledge that men are visual and attracted to women's overt sexuality, and that the hijab limits temptation, thereby keeping family intact. As one Muslim sister explained, we don't subscribe to the worldview that it's a men's problem. If they have a certain bent, they should deal with it. Now, the people who hurl their crude remarks in our direction are apparently unaware of this. Therefore, and quite unfortunately, we don't have to imagine what it would be like to live in a country in which a veiled woman walks into a shop and is barked at by the salesperson who states, "We don't serve people like you here." We don't have to imagine what it would be like to live in a country in which, upon patronizing a museum, a woman, a Bahamian woman, is demanded to provide proof of her citizenship because she's covered in far too much cloth to be a Bahamian. We don't have to imagine what it would be like to live in a country in which individuals screech slurs at fellow citizens simply because those individuals adhere to a different set of religious principles. We don't have to imagine what it would be like to live in a country in which, at the National Institution of Higher Education, COB, a female is asked, not by a lecturer, by the way, but by an invited guest, why she is even bothering to pursue a certain career path, as there is no chance of her succeeding with that ting on her head. Again, we don't have to imagine what it would be like to live in a country in which Bahamian children must listen to their mothers being insulted by other Bahamian children without the offending tyke receiving as much as a hush from his or her parent. We don't have to imagine it because this is where we live. And coming full circle, I think the root of it is ignorance. So to conclude, I don't want to make it sound like that this is our daily experience. We don't encounter this on a daily basis, but it's not uncommon. So ignorance is a disease which has led to the downfall of many a nation, and we need to eradicate it going forth. And the most effective antidote, and it's been said many, many times over again, is education, education, education. And I'm being told I have 5 minutes left. I'm nearly done. So, so that's essentially it. What Smith said regarding tolerance and whatnot, it comes from education, because what he says exactly is, it may seem utopian in the sense that a society that desires to be homogeneous is not a utopia. Such a utopia is neither in line of evolutionary trends to greater complexity and heterogeneity, nor is it a necessary prerequisite for social order. We may have racial and cultural pluralism in a single territorial unit without conflict, where there is an opportunity through communication and through channels of mobility for core values and desired statuses to be diffused to the various segments of the social structure. Thank you.
I think we owe Nisa an applause once again. What an excellent presentation. Very insightful. Very insightful. And not last but certainly not least is Ian Bethel Bennett, who will now come and present his paper on gender discourses.
Good evening, everyone. I have to apologize because there's no way I can present this paper in 15 minutes. It's one of those hulking things that just will go on and on. So I won't even bother to try. What I will do is discuss where it comes from. It sort of develops out of a year of working at the OAS, and in particular at the Inter-American Commission of Women, and then coming back into the region and looking at the way feminism was beginning to play out in the region after the experiences of looking at masculinity and femininity. And then after that coming to the Bahamas and seeing how it was all very interestingly the same thing. That one of the things a lot of the students were saying to me was that they had proved that they were equal because they could have babies at 18, and this was their mark of being a woman and fully realizing their feminist tendencies, which for me was interesting because then it also showed that there was something else going on. And I wanted to start off with some quotes that kind of talk about the problems that we have in terms of division of labor. The division of labor within the family is subordinate to the broader social division of labor, now thoroughly rooted in class structure and the production process. What was first only a latent form of slavery in the family develops into a full-blooded slavery where wife and child become the property of the husband/father. The abstract unity previously attributed to relations between the sexes develops into its opposite. In these realms where women have effective control over the production process, most notably in agriculture, men take over. And I'm going to jump. The inheritance of private property could only be assured through patrilineal familial relations. And it was the enforcement of this that wrote the final chapter of what Engels referred to as a world historical defeat of the female sex. The overthrow of mother right was a world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. He goes on to demonstrate why in which the privatized family developed in response to the developing social, political, and economic relations between men and women. He traces a movement from group marriage to pairing marriages to monogamy as the predominant forms of family, concluding that monogamy, which ever only applied to women in any case, is a finely tuned historical mechanism for the oppression of women. And I end that quote, and I go on to quote from The Question of Social Transformation, and this is a text by Judith Butler. Butler she starts with, feminism is about the social transformation of gender relations. Probably we could all agree on that. If gender is not the preferred word for some, even if gender is not the preferred word for some. And yet the question of the relationship between feminism and social transformation opens up onto a difficult terrain. And this is particularly poignant in the colonial, post-colonial paradigm that we live in the Bahamas. And this paper actually compares Puerto Rico, Barbados, and the Bahamas, looking at the way gender plays itself out in the post-colonial as well as in the colonized space that is Puerto Rico, and how gender-based violence is on the increase because violence in general is on the increase. And it is played out because women are perceived as a weaker sex, and so violence filters down. So when you have male-on-male violence, people don't perceive that as being gender-based, but it is gender-based. It's just not violence against women. But it's usually based on the fact that one man is perceived to be softer than the other man, which then opens up a whole dynamic of violence as we see it in cultural performance, or the performance of culture, and the performance of the culture of masculinity and femininity. In Puerto Rico, which is still a colony of the United States, there is an entrenched coloniality that Mignolo talks about. And it is the inferiority of the colonized subject that is so important for us to understand, because we seem to think that we have transcended that, when in fact we are imprisoned inherently in that colonial, post-colonial, or colonized paradigm. And it does a great deal of violence to us, as we see in the work of Fanon, and even when we move beyond and we start looking at people like Stuart Hall. So the coloniality of the Bahamas really determines our interpersonal relations, and that has to be remembered at all times, because we seem to have fallen backward when it comes to gender transformation and gender equality. A lot of the girls in classes say things like, well, I don't need to be equal to anybody, or I am equal because I can have babies and my boyfriend can't, or I can do what I want to and still be independent, even if I have 3 or 4 children. How does a single mother, manage to support 3 or 4 children and still be independent? That's my thinking, but obviously I am on the wrong page. I begin this quote from Butler to illustrate the idea behind feminism, at least as Butler sees it. I link this with Stuart Hall. It refers to in Race, the floating signifier, as the apparent fixity of the categories of race that develop over time through the insistence that particular roles and behaviors be ascribed to certain groups. This is also that it is natural or normal for one sex based on the way their gendered roles are constructed through culture, time, and space, for example, to perform in a certain way. Feminism, as Butler points out above, is meant to transform this idea and reality. Gender then becomes a discursive construct or a sliding signifier. It is not stable across cultures, but rather is culturally specific. It is ironic then that at this point in the 21st century, gender has become once again so fixed that it becomes unmanageable. Feminism too is ascribed to meanings that fix it in a particular realm, that disallow it the transformative power it needs to function in societies to ensure some kind of sexual equality. What is even more interesting, it is now ascribed negative connotations across the region and even beyond. Many young women in schools and colleges refuse to define themselves as feminist. They argue that they are in a post-feminist reality. And this has come up repeatedly, especially in graduate seminars where the women will say, we don't need feminism anymore because we have obtained full equality. Of late, it has become apparent that the gender discourse or the discussion around gender and the reality have hit a serious snag, or shall we say, been thrust back a number of years. As our understanding of gender studies has developed and widened, not to be limited to feminisms, but to include the study of the way the sexes relate to the way society established gendered roles or the normal behavior ascribed to particular gendered identities, masculinities, or how men are formed in and by society, we have also found the understanding of these issues has gone backward. Furthermore, as more legislation is proposed and approved that provide women with more legal protections, which are arguably the result in some equitable roles in society and result in less abuse, marginalization, the reverse seems to be apparent too. So what I'm building here is the fact that as we seem to move forward, everything is slipping back. Women are being abused more than they were a few years ago. Why is that? And women think it is normal to be abused, and the discourse of this normality plays itself out in popular culture every day. And when you listen to the lyrics of popular culture, you see this. And even when feminist performers transform this into feminist lyrics, like Lady Saw, she uses the same words to discuss it, but she says, stab up me meat, for example. And this whole turning of the discourse of feminism, as you say, okay, what's going on? Where are we losing the understanding of what's happening? So there was a paper written by Gordon Rollier on deconstructing the equalizer in Trinidad, and he also points out how interpersonal violence is on the rise. He also says how, he gives an example. On the 27th of September, 1993, Shirley Wilson, a 54-year-old music teacher, was chopped to death by her 67-year-old husband of 31 years. She too had sought to free herself from an unhappy union in which she had emerged as the main breadwinner and mortgage payer after her husband's business founded during the recession of the 80s. Like Ambika Das, Shirley had been and made use of the Domestic Violence Act 1991 in her legal proceedings against her husband. They had duly separated, the property and assets had been divided, and she had gone back to the house in the company of a marshal of the court and 2 police officers to collect her belongings. Her husband, a soft-spoken gentleman, relic of a bygone era, had greeted the company politely and leading her to their bedroom had locked the steel door and hacked her to death with a cutlass. This is not uncommon. He then attempted to slit his own throat, but he was not quite as successful in that venture. And I end quote. This happens year in and year out in the Caribbean, and each time it happens, we say, how did that happen? We ask, how did that happen? We're amazed. When it happens in Nassau, 4 murders last year that we know of that are the result of gender-based violence, and there are many more. So what is going on? Why is this happening so frequently? Why are we allowing it to happen so frequently? In Teacher Magazine on the 24th of March 2010, Bill Ivey writes an article entitled "Post-Feminist Students, ? Think Again," where he discusses the simply negative response people, and especially young women, have to using the word feminist or feminism, and to what he then calls enlightened sexism. Quoting from Susan J. Douglas, enlightened sexism insists that women have made plenty of progress because of feminism. Indeed, full equality has allegedly been achieved. Ivey states that this is a particularly difficult concept to fight. The article is a fantastic deconstruction of the way young women think today, and this includes my students. But he does not just deconstruct. He puts things back together and seemingly offers a way to counter this, which is what many postmodernists do not do. However, this article and the fact that it was sent to me by a colleague who had noted similar ideas as campus gave me pause. One of the things that came out on campus was, I have my 5 minutes and I am going to wrap up, was as we discussed feminists and feminism and the need for women's empowerment more, students became increasingly uncomfortable. And as students became uncomfortable, more stories of partner abuse started to come out in the classroom. And the girls would say that their boyfriends or their intimate partners were abusing them. And some of the other girls would ask, well, why do you stay in the relationship? This is in Puerto Rico as much as in the Bahamas. And they'd say, because that's normal. That shows that he actually loves me. And the next day, you know, we will make up. And so I just said, okay, so what do you get out of the relationship? She said, well, I get things. And so another girl in the class says, so you're willing to stay in a relationship where you are abused because you get things? And she said, yes. So one of the problems then that we have, and Janet Bostwick discusses it on page 9, which is very symbolic for me of the Tribune. I have a problem where the media puts things, but never mind. And she talks about the fact that as women, we have become complacent, materialistic, and quiet. We have never been against shameful, more educated, nor have we ever enjoyed greater levels of influence. Yet this is hardly reflected in our involvement in seeking social justice and true equality. She said this here on Tuesday, and I echo it right now because I think this is really troubling. And it shows us that the discourses of gender are really moving backwards. What Ivey talks about is a crass materialism, because he's saying, and what we're seeing is that young women feel that they are empowered because they can wear sexy clothes and that they can attract men. So feminism has been reduced to the ability to attract men, look for a powerful husband, and dress up in jewels and sexy clothes, and to have children before you are married, because the act of having a child out of wedlock proves that you are an independent woman. So how do we move away from this paradigm? In uneven development, the idea that women are created and consumed by the husband seems apparent. One of the problems is that we live in a colonial space that is highly colonized, and in a colonial space that is very hostile to local development. And that local development is us. It is the new generation. How then does that generation deal with feminism when it refuses to acknowledge the fact that feminism, or even femininity, is a needed part of a culture, and that in order for equality to continue or to grow, or for there to be equality or true equality, there has to be a discussion that goes beyond party lines and beyond class lines, because we are so ensconced in our little class domains that we are unable to see across the boundaries that that colonial state has created. So one of the problems is, as the colonial, post-colonial studies debate will tell us, is that the subaltern is silent, and we are the subaltern. So we have been effectively silenced. Thank you very much.
And it kind of links back to my response to Mrs. Johnson's comments. I think what's crucially important is to see the ideology that's at play. We tend to isolate issues one from another, and don't ever get into the sort of deeper reality of the condition. And I will try, and it is also a function of a language that can articulate oppression. We need to create a language where we can articulate these deep level forms of domination that exist in society. I will try to articulate right now a condition that I see present in our society, which most people don't even see, don't even think about. We don't have a language even to describe it. And it's a personal, because I sat on the beach the other day with my dog. He was, his breath on my neck. I was under the moon. It was beautiful. I was by myself, thank God, no people around. And then the thought occurred to me that, would I be here if I was a woman? And I said, probably not. And I don't know whether women, or I don't know, men don't even think about it. But we don't think about the restrictions that women are under in the society. It's so deeply rooted. We can't articulate the forms of domination that are present. And it's difficult because we know that something's wrong, but we can't articulate it. And we don't have the tools, the language to speak to it. And I think that's where we need to start. You need to start at the deep-rooted ideological level in terms of how we as gendered beings have been constructed by all the powers that are at play. I'm focused on how law constructs our identities. It normalizes us to believe that this is the way things are. It's normal. I don't know. I'm sorry. That's about. I tried to respond to that. Yeah.
I'm going to attempt to take a run at this, but I'd like to thank you for bringing up the U.S. because any country that has as one of its predominant states Texas, where many women have a problem getting birth control, should indicate to you the state that that country is in and the state that women are in within that country. If pharmacists or chemists find it difficult to dispense birth control to married women, we're not even talking about single women, then that tells you about where the mindset of that country is. It is not as glorious as we think of the United States, and the United States is only, how should I put this, a gathering of disparate states. But it also speaks to patriarchy. It is a very, very patriarchal country. And it's also a very white-dominated country that again speaks to the subjectivity and the subjugation of women, especially non-white women. Okay, so we got to kind of tease these things out a bit. Then when you come back to somewhere like the Bahamas, the belief that a woman is owned by her husband is a very fundamentalist belief, and it is believed that this is right. But the fundamentalism in that is actually saying that you should share equally
that if the man is to own the wife, then the wife is also to own and respect and the husband. It is not about the man just owning the body of the wife. It is also about the honor and obedience, or just to obey in terms of being faithful to the other person. But as Neil Smith says, monogamy was created to control women. It wasn't created to control men, because men don't have to be monogamous. Women have to be monogamous, right? And we see that all the time, because as soon as a woman steps out of monogamy and goes off with somebody, something's wrong with her. Or as soon as a man stabs a woman or slaps a woman in public, she did something to deserve that, not him. There was a case in Puerto Rico when I was there the other day. A man walked up to his estranged partner in Walmart and killed her. Nobody stopped him. And he didn't shoot her, he stabbed her. So that troubles me at a very, very fundamental level, because what has developed is not the fact that just, gender inequality, but a fundamental belief that the sexes are unequal and that women are inferior to men and should be subject to men. There's a quote that was up on a blog during the marital rape debacle, and the woman says, "It is ridiculous for them to try to make that a law, because I don't think a man can rape his own wife. After two people get married, the Bible says that they become one flesh. How is it possible to rape what is yours?" asked. Even if a woman says no to her husband, it still can't be considered rape, because she is his wife. He already paid his dues at the church, and she already said, "I do." So from then on, even if a man forces sex on his wife, it isn't rape. All right? He said, "I disagree with the bill, because I disagree that a man can rape his wife. The Bible tells me that a man's body is his wife, and her body is his. How could he rape her?" asked Miss Sweeting. All right, so this is what I'm trying to show you. As we become much more fundamentalist in our beliefs, we believe that there's a whole thing of property, and a wife is a man's property. Okay, I hope I've sort of answered the question a bit. I'm not sure.
I think it's not just about the language of oppression. It's also about the language of freedom. And I think even though it's really important to articulate, the discomfort, or what is the basis of our discomfort, even that question itself we don't ask that question, often. But we also need to ask the question about our freedom. And I think if we take that seriously into these spaces where individuals can really begin to think of their identities, think about what happiness means to them at a very deep level, I think that's part of the program. Because I do believe that one of the conditions that in which we find ourselves in this society is one where we've become so determined by so many different forces. And it's not really given us that much room for feeling free. And I think that where we have to start is beginning to tease out all these forces that work upon us, that make us who we are, who constitute us. All the discourses that kind of constitute who we are. We need to pull them apart, extricate ourselves from this, I would like to say, effing prison that we have constructed. That's the type of conversation I would like to have in communities between people who are sitting down and really struggling with what freedom means and what oppression means. Yeah.
Can I just comment on that as well? Because when I was doing research years ago for my PhD, I remember being troubled by the way the churches were made up. You know, the church was very much a male-dominated space, but it was peopled by women. And those women was very subject to the whims of the pastor, the whims of that man. And they saw themselves as, in a way, being disciplined when they fell from grace by getting pregnant out of wedlock. And then they would be read out of the church. And that was troubling to me because they didn't have a problem with it. They didn't challenge the patriarchy of the system. And I don't know if that still stands, but it worries me that people buy into that concept so much. I don't know if I think it hasn't changed that much, but I don't know for sure, because I haven't been back to follow it up.
In all of this.
Thank you.
Is this working?
Is that working, or is it this one?
Okay. You can hear me?
Yeah.
You said, where do I think, Dr. Bethel? Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'd like to hear from you. Where do you, I mean, I think we've articulated a whole plethora of problems and issues that we're spinning in, and I'm asking you if you could help to clarify how you see this sort of national project moving forward, inclusive of women.
Right. Well, I think as a lot of the speakers alluded to, it goes back to education. And I think that it goes back, I mean, we keep saying that it's the colonial system, it's the colonial system. We've been an independent country for how long now? I think we need to stop leaning on that excuse. I think it is possible for us to alter the curriculum. I think, and I remember attending a symposium, I think in February or January, and one of the presenters were lamenting the fact that history isn't featured very heavily in the curriculum. And I think that that needs to be included. It needs to be made mandatory. And I think when the Bahamian population, starting from the children, gain an understanding of their history and an appreciation, they would feel the need, hopefully, to alter the country. I hope that answered the question.
I wanted to comment on what Myron was saying, because I find it interesting that when the PLP were in power, they had Cynthia Mother Pratt in there. And I don't know what she did for the liberation of women, but she was there. She was in the fore of the party, but to my mind, she did nothing to forward anything in favor of women. She was the mother of the party, and that was it. So there was a whole stillbirth, perhaps again, but it was like a co-opting of that role of the mother into becoming something that was just absolutely neutered by the party, which for me is unfortunate, because I think it could have been so progressive had she actually had a powerful space and a powerful place and a powerful image and a powerful thrust forward for women during the PLP's administration.
Go ahead.
My name is Alicia Sands. Can you hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay. What I wanted to say was I really am so glad that we're having this, and I really commend everyone who has been a part of it and who has attended it. I am just really enjoying it. I've been out here every evening, and I'm just really caught up in it. And during the day, I'm talking about it. It's just really a fantastic thing that's happening. I wanted to bring out the point that my niece just graduated from high school last year, and she was writing a paper, a historical paper, and she could not find anything in our history for the period of the 1960s to pretty much 1973. It's very difficult for us to move ahead if we have missing portions of our history. I know that when I was in school, I think we stopped history after the first governor of the Bahamas. And, that's really sad. I don't know what my history is after the first governor of the Bahamas. And it is my responsibility to go and find out. But I think that we cannot make changes. Yes, we do need to say, okay, it's not the fault of the colonialism and stuff like that, but at the same time, it has affected us, and we cannot pretend as if it hasn't affected us. We cannot just move ahead and skip out a part of our history because it's the part that has affected our grandmothers and our mothers, and, it affected us. And I don't know why we've skipped out that portion, but we need to go back to it. And I really want to encourage, the historians in this country to do that, to start talking about that period of time that is most relevant to us and that is what we are made out of.
If the panelists give another comment, otherwise I'll just make a quick summation and then we will close out the session for this evening.
There was only one other comment I wanted to make on Marion's statement, which is so true, but I think there was a moment when we actually did begin to develop a bit as a nation, and then that was all lost, especially when they started repealing acts that tended to look towards Bahamianization. And the Bahamianization that seems to be in place now is some, to use the word bogus, Bahamianization, because it really does not empower Bahamians. Especially if we look at the work that Johnny Rogers does in his book, and that, it's so illustrative of the problems that we have in the country. Thanks.
We were supposed to be thinking futuristically tonight about tools for transformation. But ironically, I believe that the tools for transformation actually lie in the past. Right. We need to go back to the agenda, that broad, expansive agenda that was laid before us by the suffragettes, and think about that colonial critique that was made, and think about the challenge for citizenship rights, and think about the challenge for gender equality that was laid before us 50 years ago, but was aborted or stillbirth for whatever reason. And I want to remind the audience finally of a quote by Marcus Garvey. He said, "A man without knowledge of his past is like a tree without roots." And so in a sense, as a people in 2012, we are still rootless. We are like V.S. Naipaul, who said the same. He has written a great book, A House for Mr. Biswell. The idea that as a people in the region, we are still rootless. Where are our roots? And so it is true. The mandate is put before us today, ladies and gentlemen, to get back to the tools for transformation so that we have a brighter future that we can look to, moving forward, upward, onward together. Thank you for all of your comments. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and enjoy the rest of the evening.